Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. As I'm British, I have to focus on the weather. The weather outside here in Moscow is somewhat rainy, a little bit kind of cold and grey. I hope it is whatever you would like it to be, wherever you are. I know this time of year, one expects snow and cold. We haven't had that much of that at the moment, but I think I would prefer that to the rain and the drizzle we're having today. However, we have a great warm atmosphere here in the Prosveshenia offices. My colleagues are taking great care of me. I have a nice hot cup of coffee towards my left hand, and all is good with the world, and I hope the same is for you, wherever you find yourselves within the Federation this morning, or as possibly may be the case this afternoon. It is great for you to join us, always a pleasure. It's difficult for me to do webinars to a certain extent because as I travel around the country and we do the seminars in schools and institutions, as we have been doing over the last couple of weeks, I had the great pleasure of interacting with so many of you and chatting with you and laughing with you and kind of going over issues together. It has been a wonderful couple of weeks here in Russia. Hello, Ufa, I was there. Not so long ago. In fact, it was the first stop on this particular tour, and a place I've had the pleasure of visiting many times. Talking of communications and the problems with it, what we're going to be talking about this morning is a favorite topic of mine and something over the years I've become increasingly interested in, as really in many ways it is at the heart of my part of the relationship we have in terms of Prosveshenia, Express Publishing, etc., is my role in communicating with you, ladies and gentlemen, about issues that we find to be of interest and to share ideas that we hope you will find useful. So the idea of communication is something that I have personally explored in great depth. Before I mention any more on that, I should just point out, because I forgot to do it, that if you wish to make a comment to me, you're very welcome to do so in the chat. I do keep my eye on it as it rolls by. And if there are questions that are pertinent to what we're talking about at that particular moment, I shall try and answer them right there and then. If not, I may kind of try and work in the answer as we go through. But any questions to me, guys, if you would, in English, any technical issues or questions about things like certificates, etc., if you'd be kind enough to write them in Russian, that would be appreciated. The nice thing about doing these webinars, apart from the fact that I get a chance to share things with you, is that people keep saying hello, people that I've met in so many places, and it really is a genuine pleasure, and I really do find it quite humbling that so many of you are joining us and so many of you keep coming back and joining us, and I hope that we are always worthy of the time that you give us, and that you always leave whatever work we do together feeling slightly better than you did when you came in. So we will get down to business. Hello to all of these places that are saying hello. Forgive me, I can't say hello to all of you. We'd be here all day, and people have things to do. In terms of the time of the webinar, my aim is to make it around 45 minutes. It may slip over by just a few minutes. It always seems to do. I always think I have too much time and then end up having to rush at the end. But just so you know, so you can plan your lives, it's going to be around 45, 50 minutes maximum. And of course, for certification, etc., my colleagues from Prosveshenia will inform you accordingly. So to make sure we do finish on time, let me get down to business. The idea of communication, of course, is at the heart of modern language teaching. If you are a language teacher, not just of English, of course, but of any language, you will know that you're constantly being encouraged to get your learners communicating. In fact, a lot the kind of modern language teaching methodology tends to be termed communicative language teaching, and everything we do fits into, or sorry, I should say under the umbrella of that particular term. So what I like to do when I have the opportunity to talk to colleagues is think a little bit more in depth about what these kinds of terms mean. Because I know that we throw around terminology. In fact, in my previous session, I was talking about terminology, etc., and the teaching of it in the context of English for specific purposes. And of course, as teachers, we also throw around terms that we know what they mean, or at least we have a very good sense of what they mean. People are even writing poems now. I remember that one. Quick weather poem is, as a rule, man's a fool. When it's hot, he wants it cool. When it's cool, he wants it hot. He's always wanting what is not. So there's my weather poem in reply to the weather poem I'm seeing there. One of the terms that gets thrown around a lot is communication. And I wondered if you would, in the chat, just if we could stop talking about the weather in the chat, if you wouldn't mind just putting down a couple of words about what you think communication means. When I say the word communication, what does it mean to you? And importantly, what does successful communication mean to you? If you want, you can quickly put some ideas in the chat, and I'll pick up on the first few that I see, although not everybody may be able to actually contribute there. I see you're more happy talking about weather than you are and geography. We're also talking about geography. And as yet, I have no comments about what good communication means. So maybe that's a lesson in itself. Thank you. Marina, excuse me, I'm not wearing my glasses. So sending a message and understand and being understood, I think that's great. Interaction, understanding each other, we've got coming in there as well. So very much the focus on this idea of communication, successful communication is the idea of being understood. And I think that really is an important point. Fluency, Eleanor, thank you very much. Forgive me, sorry, I'm not wearing my glasses. This is a very bad idea. Exchanging information, communication is life, listening to other people and hearing them, understanding them. So there's this idea, and I thank you all for those comments, and some more, I've no doubt, will come in. I'm not going to sit here and read them all. Those of you who can see the chat applet can see what your colleagues have been kind enough to write there. Communication, a lot of it is about understanding, and of course, I'm not going to disagree with that. Communication covers a whole bunch of areas, and understanding is a very, very important part of that process. And welcome to St. Petersburg as well. But if we talk about understanding, there are a number of ways that understanding can work. There are also a number of ways in which understanding can break down. And we may feel that we want to, as someone has just mentioned, share information, share an idea, but ultimately that doesn't happen. So what I'd like to do in this talk is discuss a little bit about how we can ensure that our learners and we communicate effectively or as effectively as possible, and the various factors that can influence that both positively and negatively as well. Now, when I started to do research on this, because I take my job very seriously, because I respect the time that you give us, and I wanted to kind of, if you like, find some kind of theory, some kind of definition that would break communication down into component parts. Because some words, in a way, and forgive me for this is just, I'm expressing it the way I feel, some words are just kind of too big. You know, so if we go into a classroom, we say to our learners, hello, boys and girls, today we're going to learn to communicate. That's a very, very big idea. And it's also because it's so big and it covers so many areas, it's also very difficult to improve on. Because if I say to my learners, okay, your communication is not particularly good, I'd like everybody to communicate better, please. It's not something I can teach in that way. And it's not something, very importantly, that my learners can understand. What does it mean to communicate better? How can I learn to communicate better? And that's what I was researching, and that's what I would like to discuss. Before I go on to the next slide, I just saw we have a colleague from Yakutia in the chat. So I'd like to say a very special hello to Yakutia. I was talking about Yakuts yesterday. On my keyring, I still have a little talisman that I was given in Yakutia many, many years ago. So you were very much in my mind yesterday, and with very fond memories. So what I did is I went to the internet and I looked for this communication theory. Interestingly, a lot of work at the moment on successful communication is being done not by people involved in our field so much, not linguists necessarily, but it's being done by people working in the field of artificial intelligence, in AI. The reason for this is quite simple and very logical, that there is, and always has been for a while now, a need for machines, computers, etc., to communicate in a way that is human and to be able to interact, because someone used the word interaction earlier on, to be able to interact with their users in a way that is kind of, if you like, human friendly. So a lot of research into communication is being done by specialists working in the field of artificial intelligence, because if you want computers to communicate in a way that is more human, you have to understand how human communication works. So what I'd like to do by way of introduction, and then we'll go into detail, is talk broadly about two theories that I'd like to bring together with you. The whole thing starts, of course, with the Common European Framework. The Common European Framework identifies communicative language competences being at the heart of modern language. So this is something that many of you will be familiar with, and I put this slide in here for you, for those of you who like also information from linguists to linguists. The idea of the communicative language competence is at the heart of modern language education for this reason. And now let's have a look at what people from the world of artificial intelligence think about it. Now, because I can't do animations on the system here, the platform we're using for the webinar, I've put all the points up at once. Normally I would introduce them one by one, but I'll just talk through them in a kind of clockwise direction. So this theory says that in any communicative act, now in our case, communicative act is basically going to be spoken interaction of some sort and written interaction. So if I say communicative act, I would like you to think spoken or written language use. Theory says that in any communicative act, there will be a source who wishes to communicate something. We'll talk a little more about all of these as we get into the presentation. So forgive me if right now I don't define it 100%, but it'll save time if I talk about everything once and together. The source has information they wish to communicate, which essentially comprises the message. So you have a source who wishes to send out some kind of message. That message has to be encoded in some way. Of course, encoding in our case would be pretty much encoding it into speech in an appropriate language, and possibly encoding it in terms of writing and putting it in written format as well. Once that message has been encoded, it must travel down a channel. Now, in the modern world, this is something we really do have to think about a lot. And one of the reasons I call this presentation the idea of 21st century communication is because it is an issue we face. These days, we are much, much more connected in so many different ways in relation to the past, that there are a great number of channels available to us through which we can send the message we wish to communicate. And that is something that is going to have direct implications for colleagues in the language teaching world. And I should stress, not just English. This is true. In fact, it's also true for learners working in their own language. Now I come to think about it, that all of these points are equally true for whether we're communicating in a foreign language or in our own language. It's just that when we do it in a foreign language, there are issues that are, make it slightly more complex than maybe if we communicate in our own. So the message goes through a channel to a receiver. The receiver is, of course, the person or the persons, because it could be plural, who we wish to receive our message. So it's all fairly straightforward. Our receiver then has to be able to decode that message. And of course, this is where, for example, language skills would come in. If someone sent me a message written in Chinese ideograms, I'm afraid I would not be able to decode it. If someone sent me a message very much in the jargon of, for example, computer programmers, I would not be able to decode it. So this is what we mean by decoding. The message arriving in a way that the recipient can actually get to the meaning that many of you pointed out, the information that I wish to share with someone else. Based on what they decode, and whether they decode correctly or not is a matter for debate, and we'll be talking about it. There will be feedback, there will be a response of some sort. And that response will then go back to the source and we get into the cycle of communication. Now, please don't misunderstand this cycle. This is not just about, world-shattering information or philosophy or the meaning of life. This could be gossiping about a neighbor. It merely is just a description of the various stages of any act of communication. And of course, in any act of communication, our roles may change. So at some point in the communication, I will be the source. In some points, I will be the recipient. So there is a switching of roles. But what I like about this as a communicative theory is that it breaks communication down into steps that we can now work on. So if we feel our learners aren't communicating well, instead of just trying to get them to communicate better, what we can now do is find out what aspect of that communication is not working particularly well, and of course, teach them strategies to improve it or deal with it. And we'll talk about those all in more detail. The second idea I wanted to bring to you is an idea I came across in my research, which is labeled noise. Now, noise, obviously, it has its literal meaning and the meaning that we're familiar with. But noise, it would be helpful, I think, if you thought about it as anything that is a barrier to communication. Noise is anything that can disrupt this particular cycle of communication. So what I would like to do before we move any further is just briefly separate out this idea of noise and interference in communication, and then look at, going back to the circle, look at ways in which we can reduce or avoid noise and therefore make our communication smoother. Okay, so we'll look at this idea of noise first. Now, this has, there are 6 examples of noise. The first 2, in all fairness, are not something that you can particularly teach for. They're things to be aware of, but they're not things that we would expect language teachers to actually deal with. However, they are part of the theory, and I don't like cherry picking and ignoring things because they're not necessarily relevant to an argument. That is very disingenuous. It's not a good way of communicating. So the first 2, I'll go through very quickly. You'll understand what they are. The 4 that follow are very much areas that language teachers need to be sensitive to, and are areas that language teachers can improve on and help their learners with. So let's have a look at the first category of noise. Obviously, the first category of noise is environmental. Environmental noise can very much disrupt communication. Now, as I said, there's not much you can do to teach what to do with noise. How we deal with noise is instinctive. It is, if we're in an environment where there is lots of noise, we will raise our voice. We tend to speak with better articulation. And of course, when we speak, interestingly enough, when we are communicating in a noisy situation, we shorten our sentences for purposes of comprehension, and also because when we're speaking loudly, it's more tiring for the diaphragm, we're using more breath, and we can't actually speak in particularly long sentences. It's an interesting idea to think about, but I accept that it's not particularly something we can deal with in the classroom. I'm not going to suggest that you have your learners make lots of noise and practice their English in that environment. I don't think your colleagues would particularly appreciate that piece of advice. So we'll move on to the next one, which again is not something that you can directly teach for. It's great if we can be sensitive to it, and it's worth mentioning just a couple of points. But again, it's one of those things where it's a general point, not specifically about language teaching. It's what's known as physiological noise. So for example, if people have a hearing impairment, if someone is deaf, for example, if someone has a speech impediment, or maybe someone is visually impaired, they have problems with their sight, these are, of course, things that can damage or interrupt communication. Now, again, I don't expect you to teach your learners for this, but just as educationalists, it is worthwhile thinking about a couple of very quick points before we leave this slide. For example, if people are deaf, I can speak with some confidence on this. My mother was a teacher of the deaf for her entire professional career. And then before her retirement, she went on to be a trainer of teachers of the deaf. So I have some inside knowledge of this. And I first was in contact with deaf learners, with learners with hearing issues when I was very young, and I visited my mother at school. And one of the first things my mother taught me was that when you are speaking to someone who does have hearing issues, the worst thing you can do is shout, because when you shout, you distort your lips, and it becomes much harder for people trying to read your lips to actually do so. So if you do have kids in your classroom or in your school who have hearing issues, please do remember they do need to see your face full on when you're speaking. It's polite to make sure you maintain that, and you should also not shout. You should speak at a normal pace, at a normal volume, so that they can follow your lips. As regards, obviously, things like speech impediments, things like stammers, etc. Again, when I was a child, I had a very good friend whose father had a very severe stammer. Interestingly, not when he sang. He was a very good singer. But when he was speaking, he had a very good stammer. And really, the only thing you can do there is just be patient. If you start finishing people's sentences and kind of ignoring them when they get stuck and carrying on the conversation without them, it's just kind of rude. And ultimately, it will lead to stress. And the more they get stressed, in many cases, the worse the impediment becomes. Those of us who are lucky enough not to have such an issue, I think the least we can do is show just a little bit of patience to people in that situation, and be thankful that this is not our problem. People who are visually impaired, of course, these days, thankfully, there's a lot more help available to them in terms of things in Braille, in readers online. So, for example, text-to-voice applications, etc. It's still not easy. I'm not pretending it will ever be easy. But in terms of learning, of course, there are options for them these days that maybe weren't around so long ago. But still, they deserve our consideration and the best that we can do to help them out. So, physiological noise, as I said, something to be sensitive to, but not something we can necessarily teach for. The remaining categories of this noise theory are things that directly concern us, and I'm sure you'll see the minute I introduce them. So, the first area of noise that I think is of importance to language teachers and is something we need to be thinking about is semantic noise. Semantic noise when someone is confused by what they think you meant, or in fact what you did mean. Semantic noise is something that can crop up in so many different places and is a big issue, I think, for teachers of foreign languages. Certainly, semantic noise can take different forms. I tend to think of it as things, for example, that can be generational. For example, the terms, the terminology, the idioms, I should say, the idioms, the slang that young people tend to use. Every generation has its own slang, etc. The example I always use is a form I came across where something is described as being sick. And apparently this is a good thing. So if that was a sick concert or that's a sick car, apparently it doesn't mean that it needs a doctor's attention. It means that, in very simple terms, it's good, it's kind of cool. There's always a problem, I think, whenever you're teaching language, that there are terms, there are expressions, there is language that you're never going to be able to teach. And as course book providers, for example, we can never include. The minute you include terminology like this, the chances are by the time the learner actually gets to the book, that particular term, that particular phrase may no longer be in fashion. These things tend to be rather ephemeral. They have a very short life. Some of them go out and come back in again with different meanings. What we can do is be realistic and accept that although we may not think of it as particularly good language use or something that we particularly want to encourage, that this is an issue our learners have to deal with, and be honest, and if they come in with questions, answer them as best we can, but also get them to be aware of the fact that language is used idiosyncratically, language is used generationally. And you know what, for me, that's part of the fun of language and part of the beauty of language, that people use it in a way that makes sense to them. And I think that's what makes language ultimately one of the most democratic things there is. People who use the language decide what it means. It can create problems. Learners should be sensitive to it. And as much as we can keep our ears open and hear what language is being used and where. But more importantly, encouraging our learners when they are exposed to language that is more kind of slang, etc., to become sensitive to the context in which it's used. Those of you who know me will, for example, know that I speak Greek. And there are expressions in Greek that I use that I really can't translate and possibly wouldn't translate, but I know the context in which they should be used. I know their social linguistic kind of effect. I know what would be appropriate to use in front of my boss. I would know what to be possible to use when I'm sitting with my friends, maybe having coffee or whatever. Learners need to become sensitive to these things. I also think there are geographical elements to this semantic noise, in that the English maybe that is learned in different countries is not always the same, that learners do learn different things, and of course native language interference in their second or their foreign language can also affect the way they use certain words or use certain phrases. And I think that, again, is something that we have to train learners to be sensitive to. For example, if they're watching a YouTube video, or you have maybe some kind of exchange, either physically or maybe via Skype or whatever. I know that Russian schools quite often have exchange programs where they may take some students to a school in another country or bring those students here. It is very interesting for learners to listen to how those other students use their language and the meanings they attach to things. Again, they should always listen first and think before trying to copy what goes on. But semantic noise is an issue, and it's something we do need to be aware of. The next area of noise, syntactical noise, getting the grammar wrong. The text box you have on the screen is just something I stole from the internet so that I could have something in front of you. But learning that grammar does matter, that the misuse of grammar or the lack of grammatical knowledge can create noise in conversation. It can create noise in communication, for example, in written form. So learners do need to be aware of it. I have a very good friend. I mentioned him in the first seminar. I don't think he knows I'm talking about him. He's not Greek, he's Albanian. I'm English. When we communicate with each other, we communicate in Greek. My friend has never learned how to differentiate between masculine and feminine pronouns. So when he's talking about a woman in conversation, whenever he's using pronouns, object, possessive or whatever, he ends up slipping into masculine pronouns, which, if you don't know him, can be incredibly confusing, because people who have been kind of listening into the conversation are suddenly kind of jarred out of it by thinking that we were talking about a woman, now we're talking about a man. Who is this person? So a lack of syntactical knowledge is noise. It is disruption. It is a barrier to good communication. There is no getting around it. And I do think it is one of the reasons why grammar is still very important. However, it is important that grammar is taught from its communicative aspect. How can this knowledge of grammar help me communicate better, help me let people know what I want to tell them better in written or spoken form? That's where we need to come from, not grammar as an abstract structure studied in its own right. That is for linguists to do. It is not what we should be doing in the foreign language classroom. The next area of noise, organizational. I think it kind of speaks for itself. If our writing is badly organized, if we're going all over the place, if we're not using linkers, if the reader can't understand what we're doing in a particular paragraph, if we put too many ideas in the same paragraph, if things are in an illogical order so that learners can't follow, readers can't follow the structure of what we're saying, they can't follow our thread from start to finish, that is going to create noise. And this, of course, is why we, and I know you, tell your learners that they have to organize their work, they have to plan their compositions, they have to take care to read things back again. The number of emails that I get that someone obviously has not read again, it bothers me slightly, because if someone's sending email, they should double check it to make sure that it's smooth, to make sure that it's not too wordy, to make sure that the information structure is clear. Of course, in email, that can be the use of things like bullet points. Bullet points are a great thing to use in things like email to make sure that everyone has understood very quickly what needs to be done or what's being asked. So learners need to learn how to arrange the information that they wish to communicate in a way that is easily absorbed. It is easy for the other person to pick up on and follow and act on. So this is something that has to be worked on, and as teachers, I know you agree. Cultural noise is another area that is something that we have to make, I think, our learners sensitive to, although I fully accept that we can't teach everything. Different cultures around the world use language in different ways. They have different ways of behaving and interacting with each other. Someone mentioned in answer to my first question that good communication is about interaction, and that interaction can fail if, for example, we make some kind of cultural mistake. Please remember that people's idea of politeness, for example, are very ingrained. These are things that we grow up with, and they're things we learn from a very young age. Therefore, they're very much part of our identity, both as individuals and the group with which we identify in a broader sense. So if someone kind of breaks those cultural rules, although people are obviously intelligent and people are can be very sophisticated and what have you, and they can say, you know, it's okay, this person didn't know that was rude, on a kind of subconscious level, it can be very damaging to communication if you feel that this person has broken one of those rules. Now, as I said, you can't teach culture to learners, not every culture, certainly. But what we can do is remind our learners that they need to be a little bit sensitive to the signals they're receiving, to keep their eyes and ears open when they're in communication with someone from another culture, and sometimes to explain things very, very clearly, because this is a two-way street. It's not just about Russian students being accepting of other people's cultures. It's also about Russians explaining to other people what is culturally acceptable to them. And sometimes the best thing to do is just say it very clearly, oh, in my country, in my culture, we do it this way. Not as a better or worse thing, but just getting it out there so everybody knows where the rules are, where the boundaries are, and that communication doesn't break down inadvertently, because it tends to be inadvertently. We tend to get things wrong. The final area of noise, I love this emoticon. It looks like me when I find there's no coffee in the morning, is psychological noise. Again, this is about good communication because it's really about understanding where the other party to the conversation is. A very quick example is when on occasion, I've been traveling and my luggage has been lost. It's something that makes me really quite angry. Because everybody does their job, and I do feel that getting luggage from one place to another is a job that someone's supposed to be doing. And if I arrive without my suitcase, if I have, for example, seminars the following day and I don't have my suit, this is something that I don't particularly like. When you ring up the airline, for some reason they've told their telephone operators that they have to speak in a very calm manner and be very kind of placatory. Unfortunately for me, that doesn't work. And psychologically, it's not the right approach. When I ring up an airline to find out what's happening with my suitcase, I really want to feel that the airline is as upset as I am that something has gone wrong. I want them to understand that it's urgent for me. I want them to understand that it's uncomfortable for me, not having my clothes with me, not having my personal items, even like my aftershave and things, which I like to wear. This is a problem for me when I'm traveling, because this is all I've got that's personal, because I'm staying in a hotel room somewhere. So when I ring up the company, the last thing I want is someone trying to make me feel like I'm insane for being angry. I have every right to be angry. I have every right to be upset. And what I want to hear from the airline is not a calm voice going, yes, everything will be fine. I want someone to say, yes, I know it must be a massive problem for you. It must be really horrible that your clothes haven't arrived. And I can only imagine how frustrated you must be feeling right now. And then if someone says that, I know now that they understand my situation, and I'm more likely to behave reasonably. I know they can't get it there in 5 minutes, but what I want to know, or at least feel, is that they're in there with me. If you have a student who comes up to you because they're worried about an exam, although it's usually meant nicely, the worst thing you can say is, don't be stupid, you'll be fine. Because what you've essentially done is you've ignored the state that your learner is in. You've said, there's no problem, you're stupid for being worried, which means I haven't helped and I've told them they're stupid. If I want my learner to truly calm down, and I've been in this situation, the first thing I say is, okay, I hear that you're worried about the examination. What is it that worries you? that's how you start a conversation about what worries them, and you can help. To deny the way they're feeling is not going to get anywhere. So when we're teaching learners to communicate effectively, especially at the higher levels, it is very important that they listen to and respond to what's being said or written, not start their own monologue at the same time. True communication is about active listening. It's about acknowledging and getting into the world of the person with whom you're communicating. And that really does matter. And it matters for people who are in business, and it matters for just social things as well. If you're interested in that further, things like neurolinguistic programming can be very useful. Ideas like pacing and leading, which come from neurolinguistic programming, do Google them, and you can find more information there. So, having said that, let's think now about how we can reduce the noise that may come up in communication. Some of these are quite quick, so I have my eye on the clock, which is right opposite me here. Let's start at the top of that circle. Where can noise come in? Right. We said the Communicative Act starts with a source, someone or something, in our case usually someone, who wishes to communicate some information. And if you ask our learners who is the source in this Communicative Act, the logical answer would, for them at least, would be, I am. And that obviously is true. But in any communicative situation, who we are will change. In one particular communicative situation, I can be friend, or I can be teacher, or I can be parent, or I can be child, or I can be customer, I can be manager, I can be colleague. Yeah? So before our learners ever start any kind of communicative act, it's very important that they establish who they are in that particular communicative situation, because it will and it should change the way they communicate. If it does not, this is a point at which noise can sneak in. And this affects my message. So, for example, the message, of course, in its simplest terms, is the information I wish to communicate. However, if the message I wish to communicate and the format and the way in which I communicate it is not congruent, if they're not the same. So, for example, if I go in for a job interview, top of my head, and as source in that job interview, I consider myself to be kind of a colleague of the person who's interviewing me, the dynamic is all wrong. I'm an applicant. Unfortunately, in that situation, the dynamic is very much that I am kind of in a lower status than the person who may be able to give me the job, and I should act accordingly. So whenever learners are thinking about their communication, and this is how we can help them communicate better, they need to understand what way that message must be, that message must be communicated, so that they can make sure that both the message and the way it's communicated kind of match. If they don't, there is going to be noise in that particular communicative situation. Do encourage them to think about that, because it's not something that always occurs to them. It is something they do naturally. I should stress that. Learners in their own language, these are not concepts that they've never met before. What we are concerned about is that they understand how that will affect the language component of the communicative act. So they take concepts that they may be familiar with, and then we map onto those concepts the language that would be appropriate in that particular situation. This is why these days I have just some examples of stuff on the screen, kind of areas in which we can encourage learners to explore these ideas. On the left-hand side, things like presentation skills, learning to present things. Even at primary level, we can get learners to present things to the class. And simply by simply by presenting to the class rather than just talking to a classmate or the teacher, the learner should start to learn, even at very low levels, how we change the way we speak when we're speaking, for example, in this case, to a group of individuals. This is an example from on screen here, and I'm afraid you can't read it terribly well. But it asks learners to pretend that they are a tour guide and kind of give a tour of their local area. If you're a tour guide, you're not just pointing things out. You're trying to, if you like, promote or sell your city. You're going to talk about the proud history and famous people and wonderful things or historic things that have happened in that city. You're not just standing up and pointing at buildings and saying, that's the ministry of this is the local theatre, This is the local hotel. Now, you have to provide more information, and you have to do so in a way that's positive, in a way that's proud. Let's use that word. So by using presentation skills to change who we are and get the right format for our message, we can help our learners learn to communicate better. Encoding, remember this is the next stage on our cycle, encoding is an area in which so much noise can be created. And it is an area in which teachers have a lot of help with which they can provide students. Students have to be aware of how communication can break down, and very importantly, how encoding should be done effectively. So areas where noise can slip in are things, for example, like pronunciation. Now, please don't get me wrong. If you know me at all, you will know that I have said a million times, when we learn a foreign language, we are not trying to pretend to be someone we are not. What we are trying to be is us speaking a foreign language clearly. Pronunciation is about clarity. It's not about lying. So when we're working on pronunciation with our learners, it's very important that we work on clarity. That is the guide. I'll be honest with you, it doesn't matter if they don't sound like native English speakers. It doesn't matter if they don't sound like they've been to Oxford University. What matters is, A, when they speak, other people can understand them, and B, that they know when they speak, other people can understand them. At the beginning of this tour, I had the great pleasure of visiting Nizhny Novgorod, and we stayed in a lovely hotel. And the two ladies, young ladies in reception, spoke English so incredibly clearly and carefully. They weren't kind of native. There was a slight accent. No one would say they were 100% native, but certainly what was wonderful about it was that when they were speaking to foreigners like me at reception, they could do so in a way that was not just clear, but confident, because they weren't embarrassed about their pronunciation. They weren't shy that they would make mistakes, which they did not. They spoke beautifully, clearly, and confidently, and it was a great introduction to the hotel in which we stayed, which was a lovely hotel, by the way. And I did, and I still do, congratulate the teachers of those young ladies, because they did an excellent, excellent job. So pronunciation is a possible area of noise. What we care about is focusing on sounds that are difficult. You will know what sounds your learners will find difficult. Work with those. Lots of listening. Lots of listening is very helpful when working on pronunciation. You can read phonetics until you go blue in the face. It won't help pronunciation unless you know the correct sound to associate with the symbol. Lots of exposure is the best way to deal with that. Other areas where encoding can, where noise can disrupt encoding, grammar. I've mentioned that already. This idea of getting things wrong, your syntax becomes confusing for the other person, and instead of listening to you or reading what you're saying, they're having to try and work out what you actually mean. So a good grasp of grammar is still necessary. It's not going away. Learners still need it, but they need to know how it helps them communicate clearly and effectively. That's the key there, not just grammar for its own right. And of course, encoding can be affected by semantic noise if we're not using the right word in the right situation, if we don't use the right collocation, if we don't use the right preposition in the phrasal verb. All of these things can also interrupt. This is why, certainly at the higher levels, it's absolutely essential that learners start to look at this, the nuance, the slight differences between various words, which are appropriate where. These are things that need to be explored. And again, exposure is also a great way of doing it. In activities and exercises, we focus, but learners will truly get to grasp, to grips with it, when they come to read extracts from literature maybe, or they follow movies without dubbing and without subtitling. Again, exposure is key here so that they can hear the words in context, they can see how they're used. Now, just got about 5 more minutes and we'll be done because a couple of these points are easy. This is the last major point, the channel. Our learners now in this world have a number of channels available to them, far more than maybe some of us did when we were studying language when we were at school. So, for example, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just some ideas that I came up with, learners will these days, for example, be able to communicate by email, by WhatsApp, by Twitter, by Instagram, whatever it is they're using. None of these are right or wrong. Well, this is not about being judgmental. This is not about being snobbish. All of these are valid channels to send our message across. What matters is choosing the right channel for the right situation, which is why these days learners need a lot of practice in various channels and writing various forms of communication. It's not enough just to sit down and write compositions or email. On the screen in front of you, you have various types of writing, for example, that we ask learners to do, partially because this is very much part of Ministry of Education requirements in various countries, and not just here in the Russian Federation. But learners need very broad experience of how to use different forms, for example, of written work, and what the differences are between them and where they're appropriate. These are not necessarily as simple as we think. For example, many years ago, I gave my learners this kind of standard task. This one is taken from Right On, of writing a recipe. What I didn't realize is that in Greek, they don't use the imperative. They use their first person plural. So when they're writing recipes, for example, they will use we do this, we do that, we do the other. A simple difference, but when I was reading it from my English mind, it sounded very strange and rather unusual. So even in something as simple as this, we can get noise coming in if our learners are not encoding the language in the correct way, grammatically or syntactically. So again, then learners need lots of practice, and we, as teachers, also need to make sure that we are experienced in these different formats as well. So next stage, we have the receiver. There's not much I want to say about this other than when our learners are in a communicative act, if they're writing, if they're speaking, whatever, please get them to be sensitive to the person or persons who are receiving the communication. Get them to think a little bit about who they are, what they like, what they don't like, what they will understand. So for example, if I'm an expert talking to a non-expert, terminology is going to be an issue. If I'm an adult talking to a child, experience may be an issue. If I'm I don't know, if I'm anybody talking to anybody, there are going to be differences that matter. So please get your learners to think about this before they start communication, before they start writing, or before they start a speaking activity. It's very important that they have that in mind because it will affect their communication. So maybe like with language boxes, looking at what expressions they might take, looking at things that might be useful, and of course, giving them lots of models. Models for writing, models for listening, so that they get an idea of the level of language they should be using, what kind of language would be appropriate. Give them the models, explore the models, very importantly, so that we can avoid that kind of noise. And the same thing, of course, goes for role play and pair work as well. Learners need models, they need to explore those, and they need to actively think about them before they practice them. Just a couple of final points now. We got decoding. Basically, the only thing I wanted to say about decoding is, of course, learners need to understand what to do if when they're decoding, they can't quite decode the message properly. For example, maybe the wrong word is used, maybe they don't understand the language, maybe they just don't hear properly. What do they do in that particular case? Getting learners to strategize, getting learners to ask for clarification, getting learners to ask for repetition, getting them to guess sometimes is important, to understand from context where the problem might be. This is another area that's very important as well. So if they're doing listening, for example, this is just some, if you want, you can always ask me to send you the slide because we don't have time to go through it in detail. But getting them to think about, if they're doing listening, some more general things, not the specific information necessarily, but framing questions. Who is there? What is the relationship? Where are they? What is the situation? Getting them to understand the contextual clues, which will then help them interpret the language specifically, is very, very important. Get them to listen for tone, to understand if something is urgent, if something is a joke, for example. Get them to understand the relationship between the speakers. If they're friends, language means one thing. If they're not friends, language may mean something else. So listening is a great way of getting them to practice those skills. In the listening generally, it's not just about finding the right answer, it's also about strategizing what you can do if you get confused. Coming towards the end now, feedback, very, very important. What do I do if I don't get the response that I thought I was going to get? So when I'm communicating with someone, when I'm speaking, looking at their face, listening to their responses is very important. Do they look confused? Happens to me quite a lot, especially before coffee. Do they look like they've understood? Is their facial expression what I anticipated I would get? If yes, great. If not, rephrase, re-explain, exemplify. Is the person as skilled as I am in the foreign language? If yes, great. If not, what do I have to do to make sure they've understood, to be sensitive in the conversation to that? And if in written communication I don't get the response I get, writing back, asking, clarifying, explaining that this isn't what I particularly wanted. I'm not going to stop on all the examples now. I'm going to go to my last slide because my colleagues from Prosvišenie are hiding behind the camera with a big hook to drag me out of the room because I have to do a seminar this afternoon as well. And you guys also need time to get on with your lives as well. This is my last slide about quotes about communication, which I stole from various sources. First one from Bernard Shaw, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. This is why feedback is important. This is why we have to ask for clarification. Communication, the human connection, is the key to personal and career success. Good communication is a 21st century skill. It's a good soft skill. It can be instrumental in helping people be successful in professional and personal lives. To effectively communicate, we must realize that we are all different in the way we perceive the world and use this understanding as a guide to our communication with others. Again, this is about active listening and knowledge of the other person, of the receiver. How can I communicate in a way that makes sense to them, not in a way that makes sense to me? And finally, advice possibly for politicians around the world. Wise men speak because they have something to say, and fools because they have to say something. Sometimes the best thing to do in communication is to know where to stop, which is what I shall do now. I shall, as always, just quickly type in, I hope, nope. I'm trying to type in my email address for you. And I'm not wearing my glasses, and it's a Russian keyboard, and this is very entertaining. I think I got it right. steve@expresspublishing.co.uk is the address if you'd like to discuss this further, and if I can be of any further help to you. As regards certification, etc., you will get in touch with my colleagues in Prosvišenie. They will explain all that to you. And until then, I shall thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, be very safe, very well, and very happy. So goodbye from Moscow, ladies and gentlemen. See you next time.